Congratulations, you've just found the number one over 50 health and wellness podcast on the planet. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a healthy aging expert and the founder of the Silver Edge, and I am on a mission to help men and women just like you build lean, strong, healthy, capable bodies they love for the rest of their lives. All right, folks, we are living longer than ever, but are we really healthier? Everywhere you look, chronic diseases on the rise. Obesity, cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes. And it's easy to think it's all about diet and exercise. But what if part of the problem is hidden in plain sight? In today's episode, we're pulling back the curtain on a powerful and often invisible force that's shaping our health, and that's the chemicals and pesticides saturating our food, our water, and even our air. And more importantly, the profits and policies that keep them there. My guest today is Dr. Nathan Donley. He is a former cancer research turned environmental health scientist, and he's now with the Center for Biological Diversity, where he's working to expose the truth about how toxins in our environment are quietly undermining our health and what we can do to fight back. So, if you've ever wondered why it feels harder than ever to stay healthy, even when you're doing quote unquote all the right things, this episode is gonna open your eyes. So, whip up your grass-fed organic protein smoothie and let's meet Dr. Nathan Donley.
I got my PhD in cellular biology at Oregon Health and Sciences University to studying cellular processes, how the body works. How disease develops. And after I got my degree, my research really focused on chemicals that can damage DNA and lead to cancer. Of course, pesticides are one of those that we all think about. But what's been happening more and more is over the years, as government funding has been drying up, is that there's less and less money to fund some of these basic scientific questions that I was working on. And that could eventually have led to things like disease prevention. And a lot of the remaining funding of research, really, as well as industry funding, has been trending more toward the treatment side of things rather than prevention. So my research eventually sort of became very treatment focused. And I was doing things like drug design for novel cancer treatments. And ultimately, I just kind of became very frustrated with what I saw as a bias towards treating a disease rather than preventing it from arising in the first place. And I felt like I could make a bigger difference in the nonprofit world where I could really focus on things like preventing exposures to chemicals that not only harm our health, but the health of the planet as well.
Okay, so yeah, that's very interesting. I want to pull some of that apart. I'm just curious, what led you into, a PhD and what did you say in cellular biology? Why that? What were you always kind of a nerdy kid on the science side, or what drew you into that field?
Yeah, I always loved science. My older sister was an entomologist, and she'd always take me out hunting for bugs out in natural areas and really piqued my interest in the diversity of life and how amazing all these creatures are that we share this planet with. And so I've always been really interested in biology in particular, and then just understanding how our bodies work, how we can maintain our health, how we can prevent getting disease is always something that's really been a personal interest of mine. And so I think that really led me towards this path where I was just looking at trying to understand the fundamental biology of how our bodies work.
Right on. Okay, I love it. We're definitely going to dig into some of that fundamental biology here. Now, let's back up a little bit because you had mentioned, hey, I was doing this research. That research was drying up. And it seems to be more and more that research on more the, hey, how do we treat this, the treatment side. What's happening there? Why would that be? And who's funding these different types of research?
Well, that's rapidly changing right now as we speak. Typically, the U.S. government has been funding a lot of these things, and the government has put money into prevention, to treatments, all sorts of different bins where the money goes towards. A lot of this is done through the National Institutes of Health, which have different centers in it that dole out funds to researchers all across the country who are studying these really important questions. But, this type of money is what's called discretionary money, and discretionary money has been decreasing for the last many decades now. And money to fund a lot of this research, which is incredibly expensive to do, millions and millions of dollars need to go into designing these experiments to make sure we're getting the best scientific data we can. And so, what happened over time is that sort of money needed by the government to do this type of research has decreased, and money given out by industry has come in to fill the void. And industry is a very profit motivated sector. It's looking for ways it can make money, and you can't make money off of preventing disease. You can make money off of treating it. And so that's where a lot of the funds have gone to. And I want to say treating disease is a very great thing to put money into. Disease is always going to be around no matter what we do. And treatments are really important. But preventing it, I would say is just as important, if not more important, to be putting money into. And when money from the government or some other sector that doesn't have a financial incentive to make money, if that dries up, then we're kind of losing a lot of this knowledge that we need to make the healthiest choices we can.
Yeah, it seems to me when you bring up that dichotomy of money funding prevention and money funding treatment, and there being the obvious financial implications there, we haven't treated a lot of things that we're putting money into, right? I mean, all the cancers and the Alzheimer's and all the lifestyle diseases, certainly, and these metabolic diseases, we're not treating those in the sense that, hey, do this intervention and then you don't have it anymore. We're really treating symptoms. Do you feel like that's a fair criticism of when I look at something like this money coming from commercial interests to fund quote unquote treatment? Is that fair? Is that a little harsh? Where do you stand on that?
I think it depends. There's so many diseases out there that have so many underlying causes. I think for a lot of the really complex ones, yeah, we're absolutely just treating symptoms. And that's really unfortunate, and it shortchanges people. There are some diseases that are very straightforward, and a treatment can eradicate your disease, no problem. And so in those situations, that's great. But, when we start to get into a lot of these age-related diseases, like cancer or neurodegenerative disease or stuff like that, and I mean, so many different things go into developing this long-term. And some of these can be cured to some extent, and some are just kind of chronic diseases that are going to keep progressing. And so early interventions to prevent some of those age-related diseases from cropping up are really where we need to spend most of our investment and to fund some of these really important scientific problems.
All right, $1 million question then, or multi-million-dollar question. How do we make that happen? Because I'm with you, right? Especially, let's just kind of stay with the chronic diseases here, the classic lifestyle chronic diseases for my age demographic. So men and women in their 50s, 60s, maybe even their 70s. Our obesity didn't happen overnight. Our type 2 diabetes started a long time ago. Our high blood pressure, our cholesterol, our dementia started a long time ago. I've heard people talking about Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, right? So all these lifestyle things, I agree wholeheartedly with you that if we could get out in front of that and take some of these tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and start funding prevention, who has a dog in the fight to make that happen? Why isn't that happening?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I would say a really good way we can do that is to prevent a lot of the chemical exposures that happen in our environment, whether it's food that has pesticides on it or water that has PFAS in it, or, you name it. There's thousands of different exposures that are correlated with disease. And, a lot of times this acts in concert with other things like lifestyle factors that we have or genetic factors. There's a lot of complexity here, and I think that turns a lot of people off to studying it, because it is a lot of these diseases are multifactorial. But I would say that there needs to be a lot of investment into oversight of some of these industries that are releasing pollutants out there, like pesticides or chemical contaminants. And by doing that, we could really start to cut down on incidents of disease development over time.
All right. Yeah, this is where I want to go with this. I think it's going to be a fun conversation. Okay. So I think we're all on the same page with you. This is complex, nuanced, and multifactorial. certainly when we look at these lifestyle diseases, these chronic diseases, we can say there's obviously we're more sedentary than ever as a civilization and culture. Our nutrition is horrible, and we can talk about some of the reasons why that is. And then we have this third leg of the stool, if you will, this environmental toxins. Now, I have some control, or I have control. I have agency over how I move myself, intentional movement and exercise, all that stuff. To a lesser degree, I have control over the nutrients I put into my body, eating foods that nourish and honor my body. And to a smaller degree, I have control over the toxins. So in my household, I can choose hygiene products and cleaning products, then maybe get a water filtration system. So I have some control there. But what I don't have control over is this. You had mentioned things like pesticides and herbicides. And can you talk a little bit about, well, let's back up. Can you talk a little bit about the history when those things first started to become widespread, where we are now? What is the prevalence of pesticides and pesticide pollutants today?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, pesticides started being used widely here during the Industrial Revolution. And the types of chemicals being used has kind of undergone a change. Things we think of in the past about pesticides like DDT and the things that were very prevalent in the 60s and 70s, most of them have gone on the wayside. They're out. They've been banned more or less in this country. As those sort of older organochlorine pesticides went out, a new class came in, and so that's the chemical milieu that we're all being exposed to right now is kind of the things that came in to replace the DDTs and the aldrins and some of these really really nasty things that the environmental movement had a really big win in getting rid of in the 70s. And so our use of pesticides, at least insecticides, kind of peaked in the 80s and is sort of very slowly been trending down. But the amount of land treated with those pesticides has kind of gone up. As we've been using a little bit of less, we're using it on more area. And when it comes to herbicides or weed killers, their use has been, skyrocketing for the last many decades. And right now in this country, we use about 1.2 billion pounds with a B of pesticides each year. So that's this year, 1.2 billion, next year, 1.2 billion, and so on and so forth. And that is happening year after year. And this is, being sprayed out in agricultural environments or rural environments, and eventually making its way into food, making their way into water. And that's the worry here, is that these are not just passive bystander chemicals, that are just not having any effect on us. A lot of them can interact with our biologies in many complex ways and harm our health. And so the sheer amount of chemical contamination going into food production right now is astronomical. And not a lot of people really realize the true scope of it.
Yeah, the true scope of it, 1.2 billion pounds annually is quite alarming. And now, just to be clear, I'm guessing that the reason we're using this then is it's a financial reason, of course. But if I am one of these monocrop giant new factory farmers, I want the biggest yield of crops. So let's just use corn, for example. You can go buy corn rows and it's amazing. There's nothing growing but corn in there. There's not a single weed popping up in there. And that should make a red flag go up. So what's happening is if I'm a large industry, I'm going to sell these big giant farmers GMO seeds, because that GMO seed is going to be resistant to the poison that I'm then going to spray on it. That's going to allow me to have a larger yield. And I think the argument is, well, we've got to feed people at this much larger scale. So now I have this industrial farming as opposed to small mom and pop farms. Is that the model that we need, or other models like there's regenerative farming, there's small farms? Is it fair to say that we'll starve to death as a global community if we don't have these large-scale farms, and these large-scale farms have to use these really drastic techniques in order to get this tremendous yield? Or is that not the truth?
That's not the truth. In fact, we produce enough food right now to feed the population, the projected population in 2050, a vegetarian diet. So right now we grow a lot of corn and soy. This is a lot of land to produce a very bountiful crop to feed to animals, and then we get a little bit of meat out of that. So I think there's a lot of problems here. One is that we eat too much meat. Not saying everyone has to become vegetarian overnight or anything, but if we reduce our meat consumption, we can really take out a major stressor on this system that is produce, because there's a very inefficient process of translating, grain to meat. Another thing is, you're right, we grow monocultures of crops. And so across Iowa, you've got hundreds of thousands, millions of acres of just corn and soybean fields.
Yeah.
And you're right, if you go and look at these fields, there's not a single other living thing in these fields other than that plant. And the reason they're able to grow crops in this manner is because of pesticides. If you grow a crop over 100,000 acres of land, that is just breeding a pest pressure. The pests, the insects that eat those roots, the weeds that thrive in those fields are going to just explode, because that's the only plant you've got in that, enormous amount of area. So this monoculture system we've got going on here really necessitates chemical pesticides. And most chemical pesticides are relatively cheap and easy, and that's why they are being used. But there's this collateral damage that is not being taken into account in that cost benefit scenario that I think really shifts the equation from, let's use this, it's easy and cheap, to, now there's a better system we could use that doesn't have all of this, collateral damage in terms of people's health.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I want to come back to that. I want to go back to something that you just mentioned earlier. And you mentioned, hey, meat is more, I guess, ecologically expensive than grain. And I think you're coming at this because most of this grain that we're growing, the soybean and the corn, we're feeding to livestock. But is it not fair to say that if I eat, say, a ribeye steak or even organ meat, that the nutrient density of that is much, much higher than, say, grain or soybean? Is that a fair? So when I'm looking at comparing grains to meat, they have different nutrient values. Yes, no?
Well, where I'm coming at is looking at the land, right? We have a finite amount of land where we can grow food. And so if we're using that in a way that is inefficient, then that is, somewhat of an area we need to take a look at. Now, I'm not saying we should keep growing 100 million acres of corn and soy in that land. That land can be used for, a much more nutrient dense crop. And I would say should, but, we have obviously incentive structures in place to make it such that corn and soy are really, the biggest name in town when it comes to much of the Midwest.
Yeah. And I think it's also safe to say that corn and soy aren't things that these cattle that are eating them would naturally eat. So we have this very artificial ecology that we've set up here. All right. So let's talk a little bit about why, especially corn and soy, is it because we are subsidizing these things? Because it seems to me that when we talk about, when you look at highly industrial, highly processed foods, they're just full of basically soy and corn. So it's high fructose corn syrup because this stuff is practically free. So if I'm PepsiCo or Nestle or one of these giant companies, I'm beholden to my stockholders, right? I'm not beholden to Kevin or Nathan's optimal health here. Is that why we see so much emphasis on those crops, or why specifically corn and soy being so big?
Yeah, subsidies are a big part of that. I would say most of the corn in this country is grown, for either feeding livestock or to make ethanol, which is, fuel additive that we put in our cars. And so, to call these things food is it's a bit of a stretch. You can't eat corn, but most of the corn grown in this country is what's called, field corn.
Yeah.
It's you would not want to eat it. This is not really edible. The sweet corn, which we think of as like the corn on the cob you can eat, that's like 1% of the corn we grow. So, and soybeans, same thing. A lot of that is going towards different things, not to put on directly on people's dinner plates. So, it's kind of tough to wrap up corn and soy into a conversation about food because, these should not be thought of as food, at least the way they're being grown in this country. And you're right, there's a corporate subsidy structure in place to make it so that a lot of these farmers are just kind of stuck in this commodity crop treadmill that they're in. And it prevents a lot of the efforts that need to happen with crop diversification. So let's get different crops in here. Let's rotate, 5 or 6 different crops on the same field year after year, instead of just growing corn, soy, which is what is happening right now.
All right, let's talk a little bit about this monocropping, because, and we've brought this up in several of our recent podcast episodes here, where we've had a couple guests on, have talked about soil health from the perspective of the soil that our vegetables are grown in today, especially in these large monocrop type outfits, is not the same as our grandparents had, right? So the minerals and the nutrient density is not there. That, and the fact that most of our vegetables are grown either across the country or maybe even across the globe at this point. And by the time they arrive, they go to a distribution center, they come to trucked halfway across the world, go to another distribution center, go to a grocery store before I pick them up. Even if that's my organic vegetables, the nutrient density is really, really not the same. When we monocrop, is it safe to say we're just nuking the soil, especially because a monocrop just assumes that because there's always pesticides involved, right? What's happening to soil health in these large environments? And then how is that affecting our food supply?
Well, I think a lot of the reason soils are suffering so much in agricultural areas is that agricultural land is just highly processed.
Right.
There's just a lot going on there. There's tilling, there's a ton of chemical applications, fertilizers and pesticides. It's just a highly processed land, and no plants are really allowed to take root there unless you're growing, like fruit trees or something like that, where you've got like a perennial crop where you're not, harvesting and replanting year after year. That's a little bit different. But still, when you have so many chemical inputs into a place, it throws everything off balance. And soil, what we think of as soil, is very dark, lots of organic matter, lots of life, springtail, worms, all these things. That's what produces the best food. What is in place in a lot of agricultural areas is dirt. Dirt is not soil.
Right.
There's very little living stuff in there, and there's no ability to draw on water, so you get higher amounts of flooding. In times of drought, you get dust storms. It's really nasty stuff. And so, yes, absolutely. We need to be putting more research into how can we still grow food in areas, but maintain healthy soil. So we're maintaining nutrient dense food, which is what people should be eating.
All right. So I'm curious then, in your opinion, at that scale, what's the solution, right? Is it just as simple as I'm going to rotate crops, but I still have the whole pesticide problem? Is it to break these giant operations up into more, again, those smaller regenerative farming practices? What's ideally, what fixes that?
It's a complex fix.
Sure is, isn't it? Yeah.
And, if I had the answer, I'd tell it to you right now. I think what it requires is an all the above strategy. We need much more crop diversification. We need far fewer chemical inputs like pesticides and fertilizers, at least synthetic fertilizers. And we need more people farming, more people who are living on the land where they are farming, because if you're living on that land, you have an incentive to keep that land healthy. Right now we've got a bunch of, fat cats in Manhattan living in high rises that own 2,000 acres of land in Iowa, of cornfields in Iowa, as an investment.
Right.
That's who today's farmer, mostly is, unfortunately. Obviously these things are not easy fixes. These things require an enormous investment, an enormous incentive structure to change. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to at least start to happen soon, because we're drowning in that doesn't give us the nutrients we need to live a healthy life.
No, certainly the foods, you're right. I think the statistic is 70% of the average American's diet is now processed and ultra processed food, meaning it's not real food. It's something else. And that number is, that's increasing. That's what we're feeding our children. So we have a whole generation of people that are disconnected from their food. They don't have that sacred relationship with the plants and animals they eat, where once upon a time, just a few generations ago, we'd have been much more closely connected to the land, to the plants, to the animals. And now, on our iPhone, we just get Uber Eats to bring us some sort of concoction, some kind of food-like substance here. And we're feeding the beast, I suppose. And that's why it exists. That's why there's monocropping with all these pesticides, because we as consumers are funding it. We're demanding it. We vote every day with our dollars that we go out and we buy this stuff. So I love the idea that you mentioned that, hey, maybe the solution is obviously very complex, very nuanced, but maybe it's more smaller farmers. I love the idea of this regenerative farmer movement that's kind of having getting a little bit of headwind right now. And I think we're all kind of looking to say, well, is that viable? And how do you go up against the Syngentas and Monsanto funded farmers of the world with that? How do you make a go of that? There are tons of these new, Butcher Box was one of the first out there saying, hey, we have these humanely grown meats and we'll deliver them right to your door from these little tiny farmer next door type models. But they've grown so big now that they're sourcing from all over the world. But there's all these other small farms popping up with produce, with meats, with all these different things. And I'm wondering, do you think that's a viable solution? Can we feed a country or a world with a whole bunch of small farms instead of just a few giant agribusinesses? Or is that unlikely from an environmental perspective?
I think it's possible. I would think, we have lived very long in a world where that is not the case, and changing to get there is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
It's going to require a lot more people who want to farm than we have right now. I'd say interest in farming is going up right now as people want to understand more about where our food comes from, want to, are not finding the options they want at their grocery store, so opting to grow it themselves. But this is still, I'd say a pretty niche segment of the population. But as knowledge of these things grows, as interest in them keeps growing, as I see year after year after year, we get closer and closer to that place. And I will say pesticides are an important part of the equation here, because the status quo system cannot exist without pesticides.
Right.
You cannot farm
At that scale, right.
That scale without pesticides.
Yeah. Not with the yields we get. Right.
Right. And so, it just requires a major level of change. And I'm not saying we need to get rid of pesticides completely. In fact, I don't think that's really the thing that we need to focus on. But there's a lot of pesticides you use that are having an outsized effect that we really need to get rid of. And not to say we have to completely get rid of pesticides, but let's get rid of the worst of the worst, at least the ones that other countries have said, you know what, this is too nasty. We don't want this in our borders.
Yeah, it seems to me I'm a big fan of change starts with us, right? Just as the individual, like I said, we vote every day with our dollars, and then from there to a grassroots community kind of effort. But from a policy perspective, obviously we could do things like, hey, the worst of these pesticides, let's just get them out. But we could also, and I don't see this realistically happen, but there's no reason we couldn't take some of that money that's subsidizing corn and soybean and use that to subsidize small farmers to start to bring these new urban, kind of the granola hippie youngsters out and put them on 20 acres of land and give them some education around a viable financial model to produce food for their community or for their boutique audience, whatever that is. I would love to see some sort of financial policy put in place that encourage that kind of behavior. Is that wishful thinking? Are the forces so big and so dark that there's not a significant amount of money that would ever do something like that? Because there's big lobbyists, and they're not lobbying for hippies to start small farms, right? They just aren't with hundreds of millions of dollars. How do we make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it starts by the power structures that be. I think, you're right. There's no one going to bat in Congress right now lobbying on behalf of the small family farmer. Everyone's lobbying on maintaining the status quo of big corporate agriculture. And as long as that stays, there's very little incentive to change by elected officials that are tasked with making these decisions. There's increasingly a lot more interest in this by the public, and ultimately public pressure is going to have more impact on decision makers than lobbyists are, because ultimately the voters are the ones who are keeping them in the office. So I would say as public pressure grows, it's really important to make your voices heard, and both at the polls, and at the voting box, and also just in your communities.
Yeah.
Talk to people about these things, because the more public education increases, an educated public is a strong public, and it's one that will ultimately generally make the right choice. But what's happening right now is not a lot of people are educated enough on these issues. I think that it makes it so that advocating for a certain issue is a little bit harder because of that.
Yeah, certainly. I agree there's some awareness here, and regardless of how you feel culturally, politically with the whole Maha movement, it has at least accelerated the conversation, although unfortunately it's also made us more divisive and divided than ever. But it does seem to be bringing health to the forefront of the American consciousness. And I think that that's a good thing for us to be having these conversations, to have some awareness, to actually care about our health and our health as individuals, our health as a community, or the health of our planet. So, yeah, I'm just fascinated by where we go from here. It just seems like we are moving at such a exponential rate towards disaster. I'm going to put a pin in that because I do want to come back to that and kind of get your opinion about what you see in the future. But I want to go back to pesticides specifically. And obviously, when we hear pesticides and herbicides and we hear that they're being used on our food, that's bad, right? Why is that bad? What are the specific negative health consequences of the majority of our food being doused with pesticides and herbicides?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would say, what I typically say is you name a health problem and there's a pesticide associated with it,
Mhm.
which is a bit of an exaggeration, but it gets at just how large this class of chemicals is, and just how much research and knowledge we have about what they do to our bodies. We're talking about things like neurotoxicity, cancer, immune system dysfunction, hormonal and metabolic dysregulation. So basically getting more people sick and keeping them sick for longer is what we're talking about. And your exposures, all this works in concert with everything else going on in your life. Pesticides stressing your body can make it more difficult to heal from a pre-existing condition. It can make the effects of a poor diet and lack of exercise more pronounced. It can basically amplify the negative consequences of all your guilty pleasures. And even if you're like a paragon of health, you're shortchanging yourself with chemical exposures that can really cut against some of the great lifestyle choices that you're making. So I would say, paying attention to these exposures is really just as important as your exercise routine, and reading the nutrition label on your food package. It really is impactful. And it's not, I think what gets a lot of people is it's not an immediate impact. It's not like
Yeah,
you get a pesticide
it's not
and
acute. Yeah,
acute.
yeah,
A lot of these things we're talking about are chronic issues happening from eating very small amounts of this for 10, 20 years straight. That's the type of impact. And that is a lot harder for people to make the connection with. So, to a lot of people, a lot of this is just theoretical, but with all the research we have available, it's really, we know that even small amounts of these things ingested over a long period of time can really have impacts on your health that you don't really ever think of.
yeah. So I think that there's that prolonged exposure. And then the other thing, and I'll occasionally hear some health expert or maybe some lobbyist funded social media person saying, well, that's ridiculous. It's the amount of toxin there is not, your body is amazing at detoxing. It's a detox machine, to which I would respond, that's fair, right? However, we have, like you said, now we have this very prolonged exposure. Who's looking at 50 years worth of eating whatever? But it's not like we're any longer just trying to detox this one single chemical. Now we're trying to detox 80,000 toxins that we come into contact with in any given day, right? And so nobody's studying all of this complex interaction of all these separate toxins. Again, their toxins are hiding in plain sight in your house. They're in your water. It's obviously it's in your food. It's in your hygiene and cleaning products. It's your mattress and sofa are, sprayed down with anti-flame retardant chemicals. We are in this toxic soup now. And while it is fair to say that, look, the fluoride in my toothpaste, my body is perfectly able to detox that, or the aluminum in my underarm deodorant. Yeah, my body, that small amount, my body can eliminate that. But what happens when I have this prolonged exposure and I have this just soup of toxins all around me that I'm swimming in every day? It just seems like it can be overwhelming, can't it?
Really can. And I would say that, it also cuts both ways, because I know a lot of people who stress out about this so much.
Yep.
That they're ultimately doing themselves harm.
Sure.
By to prevent.
I was that guy once upon a time. Yes. Yeah. I went down that rabbit hole. It was got to be toxin free, and you're not going to be toxin free. Newsflash.
Yeah. Let me tell you, a few years ago, I had, newborns in the house, and that'll make you went crazy, trying to prevent exposures to a very young child. So what I recommend is just be aware of places where you could have chemical exposures, but don't stress yourself out about it, because you could be doing your body more harm than good. And I think where a lot of the stress comes is that a lot of the pressure is being put on the individual now, certainly with things like diet and exercise. These are oftentimes personal choices, but when you're talking about exposures to chemical you don't even know are there and you're not even aware of, a lot of people are still being blamed for exposures that they're allowing to happen to their family, when in reality there needs to be an oversight structure to make sure that you don't have to have a PhD every time you want to buy a product in the store. You don't have to have that intense amount of knowledge to make the right choice. You just know that whatever you buy is safe. And that's really not the case right now. And a lot of that is due to poor regulatory oversight. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it is industry influence. A lot of that is lack of funding as well. But we're in a place where I think there's trust right now from the public in the system that whatever's on the store shelves is safe.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think that trust is currently misplaced right now. And our regulating agencies are not meeting the expectations of the public.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. So Nathan, as we're kind of wrapping up here a little bit, let's give folks they've been pretty negative here. Let's give folks some practical tips. When it comes to let's just keep it simple. When it comes to the food we eat, if I want to reduce my exposure to pesticides, I guess other than eating organic, I'm going to guess that's going to be one of the first tips. What can I do as a consumer who doesn't have a PhD in nutritional science, but does care about my health, my family's health? How can I start to make some positive, practical change here?
So, organic is the way to go.
Yep.
The organic label is strong. You can trust it. I'm not saying there isn't any fraud. There certainly is to some extent, but it's very minor. And the organic label, hands down, beats any label certified by a company or nonprofit. And it does have a really good track record. So I'll say, if buying organic is available to you, certainly go that route. Always filter your water. I don't care how clean you think your water is. I can assure you it's not. But ultimately there are choices we can make that'll help. But, in general, we probably really can't buy our way out of this problem. And the solutions right now is we need rebel rousers. We need agitators. because we're up against the most powerful corporate lobbying machine on the planet, and they're winning right now. And the health of the next generation ultimately depends on us prevailing. That's what gets me out of bed every day. So, let's take it to the streets, take it to town halls, take it to your book clubs, your PTA meetings, your Super Bowl parties, and, get this message out to anyone who will listen. And things are going to change. We are in a place where public awareness and public knowledge is such that everyone is on this side. It just hasn't yet trickled down to the decision makers, but that's coming. Okay. I don't know if it's coming in the next 3.5 years or, the next 15 or something, but it's coming. And so just be confident that if you remain aware of these issues, if you remain vigilant, things are going to get better. And, just make the best choices you can for you and your family.
All right, right on. Well, you answered my next question, which was going to be, how optimistic are you that we're going to change this? It sounds like, is it fair to say you're a glass half full guy? You think we're going to turn this ship around?
Again, I don't know when things will ultimately pass that threshold to where it's like, okay, now we're on the right track. We're certainly not there yet, but ultimately, the healthy food movement has gone from very niche to a political powerhouse.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of momentum behind it right now, and it's getting a lot of people really excited. And the MAHA movement, I certainly don't agree with everything this movement espouses, but when it comes to the way they discuss pesticides and chemicals on our food, it's spot on.
Yeah.
So more power to the movement if they can make headway on pesticide, because Lord knows we've made very little progress on this in the last 50 years. And we need fresh ideas and a much better offense. So I think things are getting better. I don't know when they're going to pass the precipice, but disrupting business as usual, that's the last piece of the puzzle. Public opinion is on our side. Public awareness is here. It just needs to trickle into politicians. And I hope that's where a lot of the effort is being spent, because once we can get that, once we can make that switch, we've got it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. It just seems like we're up against this financial reality, this financial infrastructure that is so entrenched. And look, people that are in power, meaning people that have successful publicly held businesses that have lots of shareholders that are invested in them being continuously, perpetually profitable. That's a tough thing to break. So to me, it almost seems like we're going to have to replace that financial model with another financial model that's just as lucrative, and that's a tough one when you start to look at that, right? But at any rate, yeah, I am optimistic that we'll turn this around. I guess one last question. Do you feel like, just kind of putting on your PhD in cellular biology, will technology save us? Is there something coming that's going to allow us to overcome sedentary lifestyles, crappy food supply, toxins everywhere? Is there, with AI coming on and just all of the ways we're trying to quote unquote fix and cure these problems, in your mind, do you see a future where technology miraculously comes in and saves mankind from these dangers? Or are we going to have to is it almost like a reverse, like a rolling back of what we've already done?
We're on the side of rolling back. Technological fixes can be easy to want to glob onto and say, we got this thing coming, it'll be our savior. But I'm much more skeptical of that message that many people are trying to sell right now, because that's ultimately a message that they put out there because it benefits them financially. I'm not saying technology doesn't have a role to play. I certainly think it does. But if we're still, here eating, feel like we can eat the same diets and live this same lifestyle that we've been living, and miraculously some sort of technology is going to come and erase that and reverse that, I think we're kind of deluding ourselves personally. So I would say, technology can be great, but if you're looking at it to be the sole savior of our society, you're going to be very disappointed in the end.
Yeah. All right. Right on. All right, Nathan, let's wrap this thing up. Do you want to tell people where they can learn more about you, where they can connect with you? We didn't, I don't even think we mentioned the Center for Biological Diversity here, but where do you want to give a shout out? Where do you want to point people that are interested, especially folks that maybe are fired up and maybe want to get a little more plugged in?
Yeah, absolutely. If you visit www.biologicaldiversity.org, we've got a lot of action alerts online that can direct you to, either a regulator that's doing something bad or an elected official that needs some more pressure, then you can take action that way. So visit our website and, vote your values, I guess. Make sure you're holding people accountable to what they say. And that's a new moving forward.
Rock on. Absolutely love it. All right, folks, I will drop all of that information, the website, any socials, all that fun stuff into the show notes. You guys can find that on whatever app you're listening to this on or over on the website, of course. Nathan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, man. This was a fun conversation, and I just want to encourage you to keep up the great work. What did you say? We need more rebel rousers and rebels out there. Just keep shaking it up, man. You're doing great work.
Great. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. If you are interested in learning how the Silver Edge Collective program can help you feel lean, strong, and confident again, you can find a link to learn more in the show notes for this episode. You folks can find that on whatever app you're listening to this on, or head over to silveredgefitness.com/379. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in two important ways. The first is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is for you YouTube folks to click the like and subscribe buttons, and for you podcast folks to please give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.